thanks to all of you. A warm thanks to all of you for organizing what is a very ambitious and a very well-organized large conference with 80+ papers. So I'm sure it is a fitting tribute to the intellectual energy and dynamism of Alexander Mikhailovich, Professor Dubyansky. So, having said that, I chose this occasion to revive a paper which was first conceptualized more than 11 years ago, like 12 years ago, at the first Pandanus conference that I attended with Professor Dubyansky. It was in Prague, in the Charles University, with a close friend of Professor Dubyansky, Professor Watzek, who was the chief organizer. So in that sense, this paper also has a personal attachment, because a personal dimension, because I chose this paper because I was always interested for a few years before that in the Tamil writer Ambai, which is the pen name. Her real name is C.S. Lakshmi. And I had started reading her short stories in translation, in English translation. So I thought, given that I came to know the Pandanus circle through Professor Dubyansky, through the good offices of Professor Dubyansky, it is only fitting that I write something on Ambai. But after that, this paper didn't get published, and I had always had it in the back of my mind thinking it has to be done someday. And I am grateful to Dr. Dubyanska and the other organizers for allowing me to present it here. So, one of the things that is, first of all, I'll give you an introduction to who C.S. Lakshmi is, but let me share the screen and show you at the outset a few pictures, just who the author is and what, and one of the pictures which sort of, I can't see, okay, I can see it. Yeah. So can you see the pictures? Yes, so this is C.S. Lakshmi, Ambai. And she is one of, just let me open my presentation now. Let's hope it works. Yeah, okay. So can you still see the pictures?
Yes, all well, the picture is there.
Okay, so yeah. So C.S. Lakshmi, born in 1944, is primarily known as a feminist writer. So she's also an independent researcher, has a PhD from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, where she worked on American policy towards refugees, political and social refugees escaping from Hungary after the failed revolution in 1956, led by Imre Nagy and others like that. So after that, she taught in the Madras Christian, she taught in college in New Delhi, under the Delhi University, and she has also worked in Tamil Nadu. She's married to a reputed Indian filmmaker and lives in Mumbai. So she has almost 7 collections of short stories. So she primarily writes short stories. Having published her first book, I will do a lot of violence to the beautiful language that Tamil is. So I was written when she was still a teenager. So her first evolved work of fiction, and this is a novel, was the Tamil novel Andhi Mala. Which is literally translated as Twilight. She has, after that, received a lot of critical acclaim, with a number of short stories, including the ones The Red-Necked Green Bird and Squirrel. She has also been awarded of Tamil women writers. The book has been published as The Face Behind the Mask in 1984. So she has been translated into English by the now departed, but previously based in Sweden, literary critic and translator Lakshmi Holmstrom, who was a key name in the translation of Tamil literature to English. So Ambai has also received in 2008 the Lifetime Achievement Award, EA Virudu, awarded by the Canada-based Tamil Literary Garden. So I will now go to, so this is roughly a very short biography of Ambai as we have it. Now, I'd quickly like to show you another picture, just to sort of do the slides. So this is the title page of the book from which my presentation takes its name, A Red-Necked Green Bird, translated by G.J.V. Prasad, Professor G.J.V. Prasad, who's a literary critic, just retired from the Jawaharlal Nehru University's Center for English Studies, and also a writer and translator in his own right. So, and this is, of course, Ambai herself, once again, in her role as a college teacher. You can see the blackboard behind her. It's an old-fashioned green board. Now, this is a picture very close to my heart. This is because this is Delhi University's many of Delhi University's colleges have this signature green board with a brown khaki border. So this is Ambai in a Delhi University classroom. Of course, not when she was a lecturer there, but this is a much later picture, but it is clearly a Delhi University classroom. So now I'll stop the screen sharing now and return to the presentation. So now my introduction to Ambai, as I mentioned earlier, was with a 1998 translation of her short stories called A Purple Sea. And I'm still intrigued by the very trenchant, very rich in observation, and very brave authorial voice that comes through. In this current volume, whose title page I just showed you, A Red-Necked Green Bird, this is, as I mentioned, her 7th anthology of short stories. Her voice is as sharp, but it has become a little more contemplative, a little more meditative, a little more inclusive of the different strands of thought and perception that make up the Indic pluriverse, as Sheldon Pollock would have it, the vernacular cosmopolitanisms of Europe. So the rich cornucopia of cosmopolitan sensibilities, of nature-loving sensibilities that exists in the Indian philological, literary, and cultural traditions since millennia. So as Ambai talks about her own, as Ambai says, discussing the translation by Prasad, quote, "The process of translation is like taking a seed from one soil and planting it in another soil. The only way to do it is not to change the quality of the seed, but to prepare the soil that receives the seed to soften enough to let the seed take root. It is a process in which the author and translator are both involved. It takes time and patience, but what comes out of it is always a surprise and a joy, like finding the first green shoot in a plant one has given up for dead." So one doesn't fail to notice how throughout Ambai's work, and this is very important to understand, Ambai is often, sometimes to her irritation and exasperation, she's almost always referred to as being a woman's writer, a representative women's writer, a writer for women, a woman who writes for women. So in fact, in an interview she gave, let me just quickly read out to you, a few years ago in 2017 to be precise, she mentions an incident where a friend of hers made an anthology of different Tamil writers and included her writers as well, including her stories as well, but referred to her as a wonderful writer among women writers. And that irritated her, although the editor was a friend of hers, and she took it up with him. So what I'm trying to say is, so she says, a couple of months ago, and this is 2017, so a couple of months ago before the interview, e-journal dedicated a special issue to me. The dedication was for Ambai, a wonderful writer among women writers. I objected and told the editor, a friend, there was no need to specify me as a woman writer in this context. He wrote back saying, what you do write about women, and we do call Obama a black president or something to that effect. It can get very irritating. Like when I brought out a collection of some 13 stories, 4 of which had maybe what you can call women protagonists. In 1988, in the blurb, the publisher wrote that these stories were about women. He did not know what to do with the rest of the stories, which were about deaths, a yellow fish, a fable with a pig, a river, and so on. He said, there are also some experimental stories in this book. This is what I would like to attract your attention to. When animals, plants, nature, and natural geographical features are mentioned in Ambai's work, a lot of literary critics, editors, and even auditors, readers, consider them experimental, innovative, and border crossing, choosing not to refer to them as what they are, which is pronouncedly nature-related and with ecological consciousness and ecological considerations right in their heart. Is it a coincidence, as she herself mentions, that many of our stories are named after or have animal names or insect names? Like, for example, she has a collection of short stories called A Night with a Black Spider. She set up and spent 30 years in what she called an organization she set up and called Sparrow, which is an acronym for Sound and Picture Archives for Research on Women. And so time and again, we see in Ambai this deliberate and conscious choice, which she makes for using animals and natural phenomena and features as for voicing certain concerns, feminist, social, caste-related, and so on and so forth. So, one cannot but notice that even the caste-related, language politics-related, social discrimination-related, or economics and politics-related questions that Ambai raises are raised through figures of animals, as for example in the red-necked green bird. Now, what is very interesting about Ambai also is that she uses these nature images to establish a sense of fraternity, or if you like, sorority, a sense of sisterhood between the animate and the non-animate. So in the case of the red-necked green bird, this latest anthology to be translated, the other thread that ties the collection together is the sense of sisterhood that prevails amongst the women in the stories. It is not always an easy sisterhood, but cutting across relationships and class divides, between those with shared histories or between strangers in a pavement eatery. We come across women deriving comfort, solace, support from each other, journeying with each other, physically, metaphorically, and enabling each other to find their destination. It could be an intuitive sense of empathy between academician and a nurse from Mangalore, whose paths cross in faraway Finland, or a tumultuous journey undertaken by Preet and Malar, who overcome a supposed or a perceived betrayal to find companionship. But Ambai's feminism also makes room to see men as possible allies, and there are a number of very sympathetic and prominent male characters in her stories. The point I'm trying to make here is often these very human concerns come across or evolve as being transhuman, as being trans-species, as moving across the species divide to involve themselves with concerns to voice human concerns or to voice social concerns through the presence of certain birds, animals, and even insects. Like in the story, like in the squirrel, what happens is so the protagonist finds herself in a library with dusty books, and those of you who've been to Indian libraries know that in many libraries, books are unfortunately or fortunately very dusty. So, if you're like me, you like snooping into the corners of libraries, you will remember having to brush off a lot of dust and blow off a lot of dust. And she's sitting with the book beside a window, and then a squirrel jumps in from a tree near the window and sits on the fence, on the windowsill, and sort of starts a series of reflections on the part of the protagonist, a sort of mental conversation with the squirrel, through which a number of emotional and psychosocial issues are discussed in this short story, The Squirrel. Now, so this is one feature of animal agency in Ambai's stories. The second aspect of the animal/nature presence in Ambai's book is in another story, the very first story, which explores the travails of a daughter coming to terms with a father who has dementia. And this father seeks respite from the tedium, and she seeks, not the father, but she seeks respite from the tedium of life in a crow that visits her daily. And this short story is translated as The Crow with a Swollen Throat, which metonymically mimics the quirks and ailments characterized by her father. So even the subject of senility, old age, the problems of aging population, many people and rightfully see India as a young society, and it is actually one of the world's youngest societies. But there is also a sizable population of elderly middle-class retirees. So India is also in that sense an aging society. So many of us face problems of caring for our aged parents who are not as physically or cognitively capable anymore. We understand what this means. So Ambai uses a crow and the daily visit of the crow. Again, those of us who have dealt with India for any substantial period of time know that the animal-human continuum, so to speak, what I call the animal-human continuum, is very much a thing. So if you might, in your everyday life, in a way you can't even imagine in Europe, or also sadly recently I was in Moscow and I was missing the street dogs whom I used to see many years ago running around everywhere, taking the metro and merrily traveling in the metro. So I really missed that this time, not seeing any of them there. So, but in India, you can't escape that. Even in the swankiest metropolitan cities of Bangalore and Mumbai, or should say Bangalore and Bombay, or Bengaluru and Mumbai, but whatever, you understand what I mean, and Chennai and Kolkata and Delhi, you will see even in the swankiest and poshest neighborhoods, cows lolling around, or dogs running around, cats peeking in from everywhere, crows descending at will. So if you live in India, you cannot have freedom, quote unquote freedom, from animals and birds and insects. It's a tropical country, of course, so insects, of course, but even animals which are controlled rather brutally in Europe and the rest of the Western world are to be seen everywhere in India. Western and also Eastern world, like some developed East Asian societies also don't have animals on the streets. So what I'm trying to say, this fact of having a relatively fluid human-animal, animal-human continuum in India's felt life, which has been cherished throughout Indian history throughout the history of Indian culture, throughout the history of Indic texts, Indic civilizational paradigms, ritual practice, as being an accepted and very prominent feature of Indian life, we find this feature of Indian life, what I call the human-animal continuum, we find it celebrated, maybe not directly, but indirectly, but even if it is indirectly, very substantially in the stories of Ambai. So she voices her feminist concerns, her concrete social concerns, and her investment in terms of India's the problems of an aging society, the problems of a society full of discrimination, the problems of a society full of various levels of disparities. She sees these concerns through the presence and the voices and the calls of animal figures. It is no coincidence that many of her stories have titles with animals in them. It is no coincidence that when she chooses to discuss her work and discuss issues of gender issues or social disparity issues, she refers to lion without a tail, as Einstein, that famous quote by Einstein that the only thing we've seen from the lion is its tail. Well, he was referring to, of course, issues in physics, but Ambai uses this metaphor to discuss social issues. So we see this conscious choice, and there is no other way in which you can see this as being a conscious choice, because if you see the same pattern repeated in anthology after anthology, story after story, and Prasad, the translation, I call him Prasad because he's a former teacher of mine from Jawaharlal Nehru University, a wonderful human being, very kind human being. So it is no accident that he chooses to translate this anthology using the short story that has the bird in it. It is no coincidence, as you saw, that the title page has the picture of the bird. Although Ambai's stories are not explicitly about ecological concerns or environmental problems or the sort of issues that Greenpeace would like to raise. They're never really like that. But in all her stories, very human issues are presented through the agency and intervention of animals and birds and insects. It is as if birds, animals, and insects exist not only along with human beings, but are there in a function to remind human beings of various pressing issues of life and the planet. So I'd like to, I know that time is running out, so I'd like to conclude very soon with a couple of, not conclusions, but maybe points to ponder, which I would love to have feedback on, but also would like you to think about. So Ambai, while discussing a red-necked green bird, draws our attention to the fact that the stories that she writes are born out of lived experiences, inspired by the world the writer inhabits and beyond. In the case of this anthology translated by Prasad, she even talks of the criminal underworld of the underbelly of Mumbai, not necessarily only criminal, but the underbelly of the dark underbelly of Mumbai, crisscrossed by lives lived in local trains, packed with grimy chawls, using the tools and the prisms of intersectional feminism, which is what she identifies with, where gender intersects with issues of class, caste, religion, and even disability. But all these aspects of her writing are mediated through the all-pervasive presence of animals, of singular animals, not like a flock of pigeons, not like a pack of street dogs, not like a group of cows, but a singular individual animal. And in all these stories, this singular individual animal dialogues with the human protagonist and helps the human protagonist achieve a certain realization, or at least put forth a certain realization. I would like to conclude with wondering if this phenomenon, if this narratorial strategy, if this authorial strategy is not in some ways a move to locate her writing to present her issues in dialogue with India's rich cosmogony, India's rich mythological history, India's rich religio-philosophical pluriverse, which seeks to weave natural motifs, which seeks to weave animals with everyday felt life. Thank you so much. Spasiba большое.
Gautam, thank you very much. I would like to say, because you were not present at the very first morning part of the session, that one started with discussing, first of all, flower agency in Indian folk tales, and then we moved to classical Sanskrit literature and Sanskrit jatakas, where animal agency was extensively discussed in details. So it's quite wonderful that we have this continuation of this topic, which is, and the fact that you underlined also applies to the morning session very much, that this is the way probably one wants to think Indian civilization is dealing with human problems. So it's a very typical thing. It's great to know that it finds such a great continuation in the modern literature. I would like to ask, if you have maybe a couple of minutes more, I would like to ask our guests if someone has any questions or would like to make some remarks before we move forward. Yes, please. Sergei Dmitrievich, please.
Well, thank you, Gautam. I would like to add comparative remarks, so to say, and coming back to what Dr. Shapinskaya, to the question that Dr. Shapinskaya raised, to what extent Indian culture is unique or universal. Listening to your presentation and your talk about the stories of Ambai about animals, I couldn't help recalling very famous pieces of Russian literature. It is Lev Tolstoy's Holstamer, a story about a horse, and of course Anton Chekhov's story Kashtanka, a story about a dog. And what you said about Ambai's stories can very well apply to these two famous pieces of Russian literature. So you seem to have stressed the, so to say, Indian roots of Ambai animal stories and their connections with, well, traditional Indian culture. But I think we may discern some more universal aspects in all this. And as for, I liked your expression, animal-human continuum. Yes, and I remember that my experience as a student in India was very much connected with this, because I had grown up in Moscow in a purely urban environment where, well, of course, there were many birds around, but as for animals, maybe only cats and dogs and hardly any other animals. But you see, for instance, now my son lives in California, in Palo Alto, and I once visited him, and I found that in California, well, there are many Indians, of course, but not because of this, but because of the natural environment. This animal-human continuum is very much present there, because this Palo Alto is surrounded by hills with woods, and in every house, in every basement, my son had to face many small animals whose names in English I even don't know. Well, like scoons, I don't know. Is it the English word? Scoons. So
I think it's called skunk, maybe.
Well, I don't know their names in English even. But you see, the environment is full of various animals. And the people who live there, well, they're very much like Indians in this respect. So I liked very much your presentation. And the only thing I would like to add that, again, there are some universal aspects to what you said, not only purely Indian.
Thank
May
you
I
very
quickly
much.
respond to that?
Yeah, sure. If you have time, because
Yeah, sure. I have time. I'll be here. Thank you so much, Spasiba Balshoy, Sergei Dmitrievich. It was very kind of you. And when you were talking of Russian literature, I remembered another, what I call my identity piece in Russian literature, which is, of course, Bulgakov's Собачье сердце. So A Dog's Heart. So we have a entire narrative which is fashioned out of the perspective of a dog. So that kind of animal agency. So Ambai's stories have a more implicit, a more indirect animal agency, but like the sort of agency Bulgakov gives in the 1920s and 30s to an animal figure shows this intricate relationship of the animal presence. So animals are often a very unvoiced presence in literature and culture, right? I mean, we will remember the Hollywood film with Richard Gere based on a Japanese story, Hachiko. So that dog who waits for the professor, his master, who never comes back from the train station, and the dog waits, Hachiko waits like in a Tokyo railway station, outside a Tokyo railway station for a long time. So we see throughout popular literature and culture, and also art house literature and culture, films, this presence, unvoiced, parallel, but very substantial presence of animals. We can think of the American classic Jack London, Jack London's American classic White Fang. We can think of Moby Dick. We can think of a number of short stories, a number of novels by Dickens where animals play an important role. You are conversant, Professor Sergei Dmitrievich, with Bengali literature also, I know. So you will know a number of Bengali writers who've written through the voices of animals, who have written on animals, and who have shown this animal-human continuum. And no, I mean, I absolutely didn't want to say that this is only a traditional Indian thing. I wanted to only show the continuity that exists between India's culture, which not only centralizes, but also celebrates this animal-human continuum, and Ambai's writings, which can come across as being very, in many ways, anti-traditional, or at least protesting against certain forms of Indian tradition. So she is doing that while co-opting other forms of tradition. That is the point. I mean, so your point is absolutely accepted, and a great point about this being a universal thing. And if I may speculate a bit, I think this has to do a little bit with humanity's collective suppressed guilt at what we have done to animals and the rest of nature apart from ourselves. I think this is, as a species, Dipesh Chakrabarti vaguely hints at this in his book called The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. He vaguely hints at this. Amitabh Ghosh has often focused on this in his later novels, in his latest novels, how humanity has this collective guilt. It shows in all the teddy bears we produce while killing actual bears. It shows in all the, the cats we want to cuddle while we kill all the wolves, and all that sort of thing. So yeah, that's what I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much.